guys, this is Dimitar from UH Studio. So in this video it's going to be a little bit different because I'm going to be actually focusing on modeling things as opposed to showing the tools to model things. We're going to be looking at a concept model that I did speed modeling inspired by some other concept artists out there in the community. So let's get started and enjoy. So the idea is that we start with something very simple, in this case a plane, and in edit mode we just array these kind of quasi-randomly around, so we just have a bigger base. Then we do an array in the X direction just to start to get the variation that we want, and then we add a second array modifier in the Y direction. And I'm just playing a little bit here because it is fairly imprecise modeling in this case, because what we want to get is the idea out as opposed to the level of precision required for a proper architectural project. The next time we do a third array, again in the X direction. So now we have our variation. Then we add a solidify modifier and then a bevel modifier to have a sense of understanding of the geometry and add a bit of depth in the Z direction here. And so we can play with all this because it is non-destructive, and play with the modifiers, play with the spacing, play with all these things, but we want to make it look like quasi-random wooden slats to go around. So the next thing we're going to do is a deform modifier, and there are different kinds of deformations that you can do, and you can try to experiment with them a lot. And I'm quite thankful because there is a video that I reference with this where I saw all the possible uses of the deform modifier, which I wasn't aware of before. I'm going to try to link the video in the description before if I find it. So once we have a model that we like, we can flip it, we can rotate it and scale those things and sort of start to manipulate them in a way that we have a bit more depth than a single element of slats in this case that are flipped and that are generated together. And we continue to play with the different modifiers in our base geometry by duplicating it and slightly adjusting some of the modifiers to get some variations and to add some levels of depth into it. For example, we can use the same modifiers but with the same even center point or offset point for the array modifier, like an empty for example, to get something that feels really complementarily sandwiched together to create that bigger sense of depth within the architectural expression that we're looking after. And we continue to play with these in many different layers and in many different ways, which is just really experimenting really into something that starts to feel right, more or less, in its level of depth, in its scale, in its massing, and in its understanding of what it's actually forming. And in this case we're actually doing some sort of pavilion, and we're going to start adding some basic materials in here. And for this purpose I'm using the material Q add-on, which is a paid add-on, but I actually find it quite good because the materials are very good and they tend to look fairly well not only on close-ups, which is what most of the material packs look like for Blender, but it actually looks fairly well from further away, which for architecture is really important. So we continue to refine the materials by designing them and then just adjusting some of the properties that are available with the Material Q add-on in terms of group nodes within the node editor for materials. And that's just a little bit of play to get the materials to look a bit more like the way that I was anticipating it. In this case we're going for two contrasting materials. One is like timber framed elements that go all the way around, and the second one is some sort of carbon fiber elements. And the idea is that those two are sort of nestled together within one to create the architectural expression that we strive to create. So no architecture is true without having a person in there to understand the sense of space and the sense of scale. Even us as architects, we can't really understand a scale of space properly without understanding the dimensions of a person. So I find it absolutely necessary when we are tweaking and modifying elements to put the scale figure in there and to modify the scale of the objects, whether it needs to grow, whether it needs to shrink, and to understand how that person or people or family or community or even city or whole population sort of nestles within the designed architecture that we're striving to achieve and appease. So now we're going to start setting up the camera that we have a person inside and we have our basics of a pavilion. And once we have the camera more or less set up, we're going to start working with the context. I'm using Box Cutter, which is a paid add-on, and in this case it works great to create some sort of context. Now this pavilion, it's avant-garde, so it could exist currently in a place like Serpentine Gallery in London, or PS1 competition, or Venice Biennale, or it could also be something that exists in the future, or portraying the future in a utopian or dystopian fashion. In this case, I'm modeling something that could look something more futuristic, you know, quite uniform, and we're starting with a small module that we're going to array and generate some sort of contextual architecture, like some massive utilitarian building facades with something that's quite unique and quite different that sits in the middle of all those utilitarian facades. Now the geometry that's generated from Box Cutter, in my experience, had slight tweaks which I needed to modify and refine. And then we start to use array modifiers to modify our geometry and create some extensive repetition, like a big, large, uniform building mass. We apply some materials to that mass as well, and we start to focus now on our camera shot, on the framing shot, and having those elements sort of sit in the background and fill the whole elements of the camera shot. So now once we have the elements that we need, the background, the foreground, our scale figure, then we can start to play a little bit more with the environment. We're going to be applying the atmosphere with the atmosphere add-on, which is available on Blender Market. It's a little bit pricey for what it does, but it is good because coupled with the Sun Position add-on, which comes with Blender, we can get very quick and very sort of cinematic and very expressive atmosphere in there, with the sun, with the shadows, and with everything that allows us to express the architecture in the way that we see fit. So at this point, we're not quite ready yet. I wanted to do a little bit more tweaks, add a bit more detail to the background, add a little bit more of atmospherics, work with the brightness and with the contrast. But unfortunately, my computer crashed and I hadn't saved my file, so that's what I was left over with. I don't even have the file because I never saved it, so there was no auto-respond. Luckily, I think the result is pretty good. Would be happy to know what you think about it. And thank you for watching, guys, and see you next time.